Hello, this is Michelle at East Avenue Art, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this clematis. I think that's what it is. I did a bit of an Airbnb stay at my childhood home there, and I was really inspired by all of the exciting florals in the backyard. So I took this really close-up picture of a clematis, and you can see it's like a really vibrant purple flower, and it's on, it kind of like climbs up the side of things. And so I sort of decided to make some guidelines. I analyzed the picture that I took. I made sure I counted the number of petals that I had to have in this painting twice, and then I went ahead and drew in the petals, just kind of looking at where they overlapped and where they didn't. So you can see I drew the stamen in the center, and the stamen kind of is like two parts to me. There's sort of that balled up part in the center, where the little like flyaways seem to be most centrally concentrated, but then there's more of like the stamen kind of spreading out onto the petals. So I wanted to make sure that that was reflected in my kind of draft of the drawing, my sketch here. And I'm just sketching this on. You can see I just sort of like tore off some sketch paper out of my sketchbook that I use for this sort of thing. And so there I've got kind of a basic draft. So the next thing I did was actually to trace that onto some tracing paper, and then I scribbled some pencil marks on the back and transferred it over to my sketchbook. And here I have some Winsor and Newton art masking fluid that I'm going to use for the stamen. You can see this is obviously really well used. It's one of my key art supplies, actually. The reason why I think this is such a great tool is because it's a fantastic time saver. I don't want to spend a lot of time when I'm laying down the main color on the petals trying to paint around the little wispy parts of the stamen that are over that are sitting over the petals. So if I just put down a little bit of art masking fluid, it actually protects the paper that's underneath it. And so that's a really great sort of tool for me to use. It does get a little bit sticky. Someone also mentioned, because I've ruined some of the sort of like the cheaper brushes that I buy, I don't use my main brushes, I should say that, for the art masking fluid, because it's basically like dries very rubbery and it's hard on your brushes. So I just buy like the cheap craft store brushes for this, for any time I use art masking fluid. And somebody gave me a great suggestion that if you wash them in Dawn dish soap after use, that the art masking fluid won't dry on them. And I found that that's like a really, really great tip that's helped me. So I'm going to have to allow that art masking fluid to dry. And while I do that, I activated my paints with my little spray bottle. And I'm mixing up a green and a little bit of purple and just a touch of black to get this nice background color, because I sort of want the leaves all around the petal, like the flower, to be sort of like various colors, right? Because you would have some areas that aren't really being hit by the sun at all, and then some leaves will be in the foreground, and you can kind of see that I sketched in some of the leaf shapes that I want in the foreground. And then I really watered down my brush because I wanted the edges of the painting to be sort of really light. And then once I get that watered down bit in, I add a little bit of a thicker consistency in, and I'm just then going to let the watercolor do what it wants to do. I'm going to let it go where it wants to go. And that's kind of the fun part about watercolor, is just sort of those blooms that you get. And so I'm going to follow this same process all the way around the petal. I'm starting with the darkest color, actually, which is not normally what I do. I think initially I was thinking of that I was maybe going to use gouache for some of the brighter leaves, the ones that are more in focus that I've sketched in, but I didn't end up doing that. So typically in watercolor, you would go from your lightest values to your darkest, right? And that's because you can't, it's harder to lighten up a watercolor, because you can't really get the opacity. And sometimes I'll layer on gouache if I want to lighten something up or add a different color, something lighter over something dark. Gouache allows you to do that because that has a thicker consistency, but watercolor really doesn't. So the best you can do is sometimes you can lift if you have if your paint is still wet and you have a clean damp brush, you can sometimes lift the color, although that works differently for various colors. Like red is a very staining color, so that one's very difficult to lift. So one of the other things that I'm doing is as I'm going, I'm kind of mixing different colors in, and I think that gave it kind of a natural look. So at this point, I've let that dry, that background color, and the art masking fluid is dry as well. So I'm going to mix up the Clematis color. So I'm going to use my purple. I have a dark purple and a light purple. I'm going to start with a lot of water so that I make sure that I have enough paint for all of the petals. And yeah, I'll usually just try to mix up. See, I'm adding a little bit more water with my spray bottle. That's sometimes a little more efficient than just trying to add water with my brush. So yeah, that really gave me a good pooling there. And so I'll just keep kind of adding, different color, combos till I get what I'm looking for as far as fidelity to the picture that I'm working from. Okay, so now that I spent all that time mixing up the paint, I'm for sure that my background is dry. It's really important that the background is dry because if it's not, then the colors will bleed together. And that's not really what I'm looking for in this painting. I'm not really wanting to have any color bleeds other than what I did sort of in the background. So one thing I'm going to show you that I did is you can use the back of your brush to get a little bit of some of the markings that you would see on the petals. So like when I was looking at this clematis, I saw that there were like 3 or 4 lines kind of in the center of each petal. And I thought a really great way to reflect that was to just use the back of my brush and just kind of give a little bit of light pressure while the paint is still wet, and you can, achieve that look. I'm going to use a more pointy one with a smaller brush there. So I was like a little bit happier with this. Yeah. So that's kind of a little trick, a little painting trick that I think really helps. So I'm just going to spend some time on these petals, like dropping in color, and then sometimes I'll pull up color and you'll see, yeah, so I cleaned off my brush, I got it damp, and then I can just, put the excess color back on my paper towel there. But I kind of just, I don't want the petals to be like a one solid color because that's just not what something looks like in nature. So I play around with dropping in some darker areas and then pulling up the paint to create some lighter areas. And another thing that I'm doing is I am not painting the petals right next to each other because I want those to be very distinct from each other. And so I'm going to paint each one and let it dry before I paint the ones next to it. And again, I'm following the same process where I'm, drawing in those little like lines that I saw on in the center of the petal, and then I go ahead and I like sort of am drawing up some of the paint. I'm lifting is what that's called, in the center, just maybe where there'd be areas where there's light hitting certain parts of the petal. So I waited for those first 3 petals to dry, and now I'm going to follow the same process with the other petals that are touching, and because they're dry, they won't really blend and they'll look a little bit more, at least to me, I think they tend to look a little bit more distinct if you let them dry and then just kind of, paint next to it. That way it doesn't look like it's all just one blob. So again, I'm going to follow the same process. I'm going to, draw very lightly, draw down the with the back side of my brush, the brush, from the stamen to the kind of the edge of the petal. And then I really noticed it seemed like the petals were lightest almost in the center around those lines. So that was where I liked to pull up the paint. So that's kind of a good thing to learn about, is that you can actually, with watercolor, if the paint is still wet, you can, with a clean, damp brush, pull up some of the paint. And that's a strategy that I use quite a bit to achieve like the shading that I want to achieve. And as you can see, I'm just kind of finishing up the last of these petals. And again, just following the same process based on my observations. So I think so far in this video I've demonstrated some wet into wet painting with the background, and also like the value of sometimes just letting your paint dry before you paint next to it. And I also showed you sort of the value of having the art masking fluid, although you haven't quite seen it yet because the masking fluid, I've just left it there. But you can see I can just go ahead and paint right over it, and I don't have to worry about the paper underneath getting purple paint all in it. So that's a real time saver, and you can see all those little wispy parts of the stamen. Like, I don't want to spend my time having to paint around those individually. So that's just a really great time saver. And, not to be too redundant, but I'm going through with the same process on each one of these petals. And then I'll just kind of pull up some of the paint. And the goal is to kind of make sure that each one of these petals looks a little different. Nature isn't super uniform, I don't think, when I observe it. And so I think that's kind of very freeing. Oh, one thing that now that that one petal has dried at the bottom, you can see I'm working on it. I'm starting to add in some of the shadows. So a little bit of a thicker bit of paint where the petal is overlapping. That petal at the bottom is being overlapped by both of the petals next to it. And I want to kind of show that, and you can see that I did that with one of the other petals as well. I'm trying to show a little bit of the shading and shadows that you would see, and that, I think, is what makes your paintings interesting, is if you start playing around with like light and shadow and thinking about where that is and where that would, and maintaining consistency with that. So I'm lucky with this. I have the reference photo that I'm working from, so I can see which petals are overlapping which and where the shadows and light should be. If you're doing something from your imagination, I find that a little bit more challenging because you have to be really consistent. Like, what's my light source, and where would there be light, and where would there be shadows being cast by that light. And so again, yeah, I'm finishing up the last petal. And that petal, I think, is also being overlapped by two petals, I think. So you can see I'm adding in a little bit of a thicker consistency of that paint. And I have a little friend that would like to go outside. If you've seen any of my videos before, you've seen this little troublemaker, and you can see there was a paw in the paint. Stick around to the end of the video for the cat tags. But while I got her cleaned up, and then I went through and I wanted to do a little bit of color swatching because I wasn't sure what color I wanted those green leaves to be, the ones that I mentioned were going to be very central. I guess I mean to say the more defined leaf shapes that I had drawn out at the beginning. So I wasn't really sure what color I wanted them to be. And anytime I'm stuck like that, I think it just helps when you're mixing up your paints to just put them on paper and see how they look next to each other, and then you can kind of decide how you want it to go. Now, initially I thought I was going to do this with gouache and that I was going to have it be really pop color. Like, you know, gouache is a thicker consistency. It really kind of pops. It's like a very playful medium sometimes, and I thought that's the direction I wanted to go, but I actually sort of liked the background and having just a more solid green along with it. So as I'm painting in the leaves, I'm also trying to show a little bit of shadow that the petals would be casting onto those leaves. So I have a little bit of a darker green, like a little bit more of an olivey green that's also being added. And then just kind of as I go, I'm filling in the areas where there was a little bit of kind of white space that I didn't intend. And also, I'm trying to add in some different greens too as I go. And just like with the petals, I want to have like a little bit of maybe inconsistency in the colors too. I want the shadows, but then I kind of play around even with the leaf shapes with just like lifting up some of the color on them, because I just think that creates like a depth and a sense that it's something that's like found in nature. So I'm not putting just like a flat wash across all of those leaf shapes. Like I'm dropping in some color, some thicker consistency of color, and I'm pulling up color in some areas. I'm making sure I'm adhering to like the shadows that I would see the leaf casting onto, or the petals casting onto the leaves. So I'm really just trying to sort of like make this playful, and I think that I really sort of had fun, actually, the most fun doing this, just kind of playing around with the greens, playing around with the values on the greens, and sometimes lifting just sort of like how whatever I felt like was right. I wasn't really following the reference photo very closely. And then I kind of in some areas put a little bit of the veining that you would see on the leaves just like lightly while it was still wet. So as you can see, I've sort of like massively sped this up, but it's pretty repetitive, right? Like I'm sort of just filling in these leaf shapes and then playing around with the colors and adding greens and just messing with like the values there. And I think it turned out pretty interesting to look at. I thought it was like really messy and fun, and it was a good contrast to the very preciseness of the flower, so I thought that was kind of fun too. So while I'm at this point, and it's probably late in the game to say this, but this is an Etchr sketchbook. It's one of their landscape sketchbooks, and I prefer cold press paper, so this is a nice toothy paper. I don't really do too much with hot press paper, but so yeah, pretty much everything I have is cold press. And yeah, really happy with the quality of the Etchr sketchbook. I've been working in the sketchbook for probably like maybe a couple of years. I kind of move around between sketchbooks because sometimes I want sort of more of a landscape style, sometimes I want the portrait style, and sometimes I'm just kind of painting on loose watercolor paper. So someday when I am done with this sketchbook, I will do a sketchbook walkthrough. You can see I've got a little bit of a painting on the other side that keeps coming into frame. It was like one of my little Irish coffee. I must have been painting that around March, but probably not this last March because, like I said, this is a couple years old. So yeah, I'm just kind of continuing to shape out my painting and add some shadows here and there. I've gone back to my like original shadow color, and there's some areas where, oh, I wanted to add some like leaf shapes that are darker as well, rather than it just being sort of a fuzzy background. So I kind of had fun with that as I was painting. I was just kind of using my brush to create these shapes with that darker color. And I kind of liked that. I thought that worked, but that's what you see me doing around the leaves. And then one thing I kept doing was adding color and mixing up, getting some variety with my color and some variety with the consistency. So this is not a watery wash that I have here. This is a pretty thick consistency. And sometimes I'm just doing shadows underneath the leaves. Sometimes I'm doing actual uh, leaf shapes. So just sort of playing around, I guess, with this. And I really enjoyed this painting because it just allowed me to play and to sort of evolve as I went. And it's kind of sort of close to what I originally had in mind, but I kept sort of changing it up, I guess, as I went. So again, I'm just trying to add like shadows. I'm trying to like add a little bit of veining, and I'm just really wanting to make the leaves look somewhat natural, like quasi-natural, but also just sort of like interesting to look at. And so I achieved that, like I said, by adding so many different greens and paying attention to the light and the shadow. And yeah, this was like a super fun thing to do. It's actually very meditative. And because it was a little bit not super perfectionist realist looking, you could really just sort of chill out and paint and just play around with what happens if I do this to this leaf shape. And I think it's really always fun to play with like the wet into wet effects and just seeing what different effects you can get. And you can see my paper towel is like really loaded with a lot of that green and purple because I have been, sort of spending so much time lifting paint. And then I just really will quickly dab it off onto my paper towel. It's just like gotten really filthy. Um, but to me, that's always a good indicator of a successful project, is how messy my paper towel is. So I've gone in with a little bit of the thicker paint again, and I'm just kind of filling in some areas where I'd like it to be shaded. And there was one area around in between those top two leaves on the left that I didn't like how dark it was. So I really added a lot of water to my brush and I tried to lift the paint with a damp brush so that it could kind of look like a little bit like a leaf shape. You can see how I did that, and I'm really happy with that effect as well. Um, so yeah, I'm just sort of again spent the most time, ironically, on this painting was spent on the background, right? I thought the flowers were pretty simple. They were basically just purple, and I, was able to use the back of my paintbrush. Very interesting way to like add those little lines coming from the stamen out to the end of the petal. And but yeah, I spent actually the most time on this background, but I thought that was like such a fun background to do. So I think I was having fun with it, and I spent a lot of time with it. And I really significantly sped this up, but I really probably spent like an hour or so on this background. One other thing I wanted to point out, it's something I've been doing consistently, is I just move the sketchbook around to get the angle that I want to get when I'm painting, but also to see something like this from different angles to make sure that it's going in the direction that I want it to go. Another thing that I do sometimes, especially with a painting like this, that's like a little bit impressionist, almost not quite impressionist, but it's like a little bit different, is I will stand up to look at it. Just seeing your paintings from a different perspective, I think is like super helpful. So stand up from your desk and just see what it looks like. Hold the painting in different positions, and that really gives you a good, I think, perspective. And that's kind of how I sometimes like take breaks to stand up and look at it, and it gives me a new perspective. Okay, so with my petals dry and everything, I'm ready to start with the stamen. So I use an eraser and then I just kind of pull up the art masking fluid, and you can see that it's just white paper underneath, which is great. So after I got all of the art masking fluid up, I decided to try and go in with some of my watercolor paint. I mixed up ochre and yellow to get this base color of the stamen. And from there, I decided to get my HIMI gouache out, and I mixed up a little bit of white and ochre and yellow there. And you can see the gouache allows me to paint over what I've already painted in watercolor with like a lighter color. So I'm kind of getting those little bits of the stamen in the center. There's like little pieces that are like really sort of wrapped around that bud, and or I don't know if it would be a bud, but it's wrapped around the center part of the stamen, and then you have the pieces that are just sort of like sitting out. And then I went ahead and started painting those as well. And I'm getting a little bit long on time, so I'm gonna speed through this part. But some of the masking fluid didn't leave the best bits, so I just sort of went in and tried to make it look more like the reference photo. And as I promised you, here is little Miss Lily going on her outdoor excursion that she wanted to interrupt. And there's the look of somebody satisfied that she got her way. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you will try this on your own. And if you liked it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.